Good afternoon and welcome to the second session of our International Student Focused Political Webinar Series hosted by International Student and Scholar Services. My name is Chelsea Wells and I am the Director of ISSS. The purpose of this webinar series is to provide international students and non-US citizens with a foundational context for discussions around the US presidential election and also to provide information about how to safely engage in the US political process and political activism, particularly as a non-US citizen. You can find out more information about our political webinar series this month, as well as upcoming sessions by going to the ISSS website at isss.utah.edu. If you're interested in attending future sessions, please do not forget to register for these events through our website. If you were not able to attend our session last week discussing a basic overview of the US political system, a recording of that session will be available on our website. We will also be adding in links about additional information and other resources for each topic, so please remember to check that page for any updates. Our session today is focused on international student rights and responsibilities when participating in political activism and is applicable to all non-US citizens who wish to become involved in the US political process and make their voices heard. Although only US citizens are eligible to vote in the US elections, we know that there are many issues that deeply impact you, and you may be interested in participating in activism and advocacy work to express your opinions and educate others about these important issues. Today, we'll be primarily discussing the legal side and how to safely participate and engage in political activism and advocacy. Later on in this month, though, we'll have another session focused specifically on how to get involved in organizations at the local level, which can help to impact positive change on various levels on campus, locally in our community, and at the national level. Throughout the discussion today, we hope to provide information about an overview of rights of non-US citizens when participating in political activism, how you can safely engage with US law enforcement, including ICE, as well as information about resources and what action you should take if the worst case scenario should occur. We'll also have a review of the Student Code of Conduct on campus, as well as your student rights on campus. And then we'll be ending our session with a live question and answer portion with our panelists. We have a distinguished panel of experts joining us today, and our panelists include Johnny Benson, Associate Instructor at the University of Utah, S.J. Quinney College of Law, Attorney at Law, Anderson and Benson, Mel Moen-Vaziri, Adjunct Assistant Professor, University of Utah, also Attorney at Law and part of the National Lawyers Guild Utah chapter. Our third panelist is Brian Burton, Associate Dean of Students and the Director of Student Support and Accountability. We sincerely thank all of our panelists for joining us today for our discussion and providing their expertise and insight. If you experience any technical issues during this webinar session, please email the ISSS tech inbox and we will assist you. The email address will be posted in the chat for your reference. If you have any questions for our panelists, please submit your questions through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We ask that you do not use the chat feature. When submitting your question through the Q&A feature, you can also choose to submit your question anonymously to best protect your privacy. I will be reading the questions aloud to our panelists during the question and answer portion of today's session. If there are any questions that we aren't able to get to today, we will certainly find answers for you and send that information to you after this session. If you have any additional information or questions that come up after today's session, please email international@utah.edu. We will also be posting a recording of the session on our website in the next few days. Before we get started, I would like to mention that today's session is anonymous and any questions that you submit will not be associated with your name or your university ID and will not be visible on our website. So please feel free to ask any questions that you may have and we will protect your privacy. Although you were asked to provide your name and your UNID during the registration process, this is for internal office use only and the information will not be distributed or shared with anyone else. Additionally, today's session is focused specifically on the rights of non-US citizens in the United States, but it does not include an overview of any other countries' rights and responsibilities when engaging in political action. Before participating in political activism and advocacy in the United States, please make sure that you're aware of any rules and regulations that your home country may have about this. Furthermore, remember that participation in political activism can sometimes attract media attention. If your name or picture will be used in any media content, this could be seen in your home country as well. And there could be negative impacts if you're breaking any of the rules or regulations of your home government. So we encourage you all to be safe, be well prepared before participating in any of these activities. All right, we will go ahead and get started. Our first topic today will be an overview of international and non-US citizen rights when participating in political activism. I am pleased to welcome our first panelist, Johnny Benson.
Thank you, Chelsea. I'm happy to be here, and I commend all of you. I know many of you are students, and we're all kind of going through a difficult time. Many of us are joining from our homes rather than at the university. We are living in a time that there is so much unrest and upheaval politically, and disruptions to our lives. I imagine that many of you who are students have experienced a real difficulty, kind of a roller coaster, as you wondered about your immigration status, with the president talking about trying to deport people who may not be attending school in person, and students going, or classes going to a virtual program. I think everyone's probably aware that although those preliminary discussions about policy to deport those who are not attending class, those have been suspended. And so immigration is not actively deporting people who are only attending virtually. And that's been a good change, a welcome change with our immigration policy. One thing that we see as immigration attorneys is one of the biggest challenges to those who are here on a non-immigrant or non-permanent visa is simply lack of knowledge or lack of awareness of current immigration policy. And in particular, over the last few years, where policies have been changing on almost a daily basis, it's difficult to know what the right law is, what the right policy is that may apply to your circumstances. And so I would encourage everybody to find sources of reliable information, speak with a reputable immigration attorney if you have questions. If you're at the University of Utah as a student, speak with their international student relations to get the information that you need to be able to maintain your status. There are people in the community who seek to advise people on immigration policy and immigration status for a fee who are not reputable. And if you get the wrong information and follow that information, immigration really won't care. They won't give you a second chance if you haven't filed the right paper to maintain status, or if you've acted or done something that is a violation of the terms of your visa. The other thing to be very careful about with immigration in general is timing of applications and paperwork. It's really important that if there are deadlines, you meet those deadlines to do everything you can to maintain your status. If you're in a non-immigrant status, as I believe many of you are, and you simply comply with the terms of those of your visa, you shouldn't have any negative consequences. Immigration has few resources to enforce immigration policy, and as long as you're doing what you should be doing, immigration shouldn't bother you. So if you're a student, maintain your student status, attend school, do your best in school. If you don't have work authorization, do not work. Absolutely do not work. With F1 visas, there is, for some, limited opportunities for on-campus work. But just find out what it is that, what the parameters of your visa are, and then comply with them. Non-immigrant visas typically require non-immigrant intent. And so what that means is you have the intent to return at some point when your visa has expired, or in some cases your I-94, which is the permission to be here, or if you're a student, your I-20, your SEVIS document. But coming here on a non-immigrant visa often means that at some point you may have to leave unless you qualify to adjust status and get a permanent visa or a green card. And so unless you have that opportunity to get a green card, you need to understand that at some point your status may expire if you don't qualify for OPT time to get a job based on your study. You need to comply with the terms of your visa. Even going outside of your status for one day, working for one day for any kind of compensation could jeopardize your status if you don't have work authorization. And Chelsea mentioned this at the beginning. Many of you are very politically active, which is wonderful. But unless you are a US citizen, you do not qualify to vote or to register to vote. You can certainly encourage others to vote. And if that's something that's important to you, that's a commendable activity. But do not vote. That will disqualify you for the future, for naturalization, and could subject you to other penalties as well. Chelsea mentioned that some of you may be interested in social activism. We've seen a lot of social activism recently, locally, and for the most part, it's been wonderful. People voicing their opinion on what's important to them can be a great thing. And the Constitution guarantees the right to association, to gathering, to having your voice heard under the freedom of speech. But there are limitations to those constitutional bounds or constitutional rights, and you should be aware of what they are. Too often we've seen in the past months that protests that start with the right motivation can turn very quickly to violent activity. So if you plan to participate in any kind of social activism, it's important to know who you'll be participating with. It's important you understand what their intent is. You may go into a circumstance where you're marching or you're protesting at the steps of the Capitol building, some gathering where you have wonderful, good, pure intentions of simply encouraging social change for positive gain in our community. But if people around you begin doing things that are illegal, you may be swept up in that. You may be considered guilty by association. And with all the chaos that surrounds those kinds of activities, it can be very difficult to defend yourself, or at the very least, we've seen police officers in those chaotic situations, sometimes, increasing or even instigating the chaos, but they sometimes don't differentiate between those who are peacefully protesting and those who are not. And so I would encourage everybody that if you are participating in any kind of social activism or gathering where you're protesting, do so as peaceably as possible. And if you can see that things are starting to get out of hand and turn toward violent behavior or anything that involves any illegality, burning of anything, painting anything, defacing or destroying property, even trespassing on property, my advice would be to immediately depart. Just get away from that situation because you don't want to put yourself at risk. We've seen recently in Salt Lake and in Cottonwood Heights and other places where people went to peaceably protest and very quickly things turned for the worse. And you don't want to get caught up in a circumstance where you could be charged with criminal behavior simply because you're present with a group. A group of individuals who gather together with a conspiracy or a plan to do felonious or criminal behavior can be guilty of rioting. Even if you are not actively rioting, if you're gathering with that group, you could be held liable for that. So know who you're with. If things seem like they're uncomfortable at a point, distance yourself quickly from those places. Our next panelist in a few moments will talk much more about the details of what to do in those kinds of circumstances to maintain safety and keep yourself safe from criminal charges and things like that. Most of this that I'm talking about is very intuitive, but it's important because I think people get caught up in group behavior at times. So just to reiterate, don't do anything that's illegal. Don't do anything that's criminal. You certainly enjoy the constitutional rights under the Bill of Rights to freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and things like that. Mel will talk a little bit more about that. To peacefully assemble as a group, you may need to apply for a permit beforehand. There are certain interests that the public has in maintaining order and maintaining peace in the community. And so if you go onto anyone's private property or even public property, you may be required to have a permit to gather and demonstrate. So those kinds of permits should be applied for and received before engaging in that kind of activity. And then once you have received a permit, make sure the activities that you engage in comply with the terms of the permit to demonstrate or to protest. Okay, I think I'm going to turn the time over to Mel, and like I said, Mel and I, what we've prepared really overlaps quite a bit, and so I'm going to defer to her, and then during the question and answer period, I will participate with her to answer any questions.
Thanks, Johnny. And that was a really great foundation and segue into what I'm going to talk about. So you started off with what Johnny said. You found a cause you're passionate about. You found a good group of people who are going to go out and demonstrate, and now you're there. You're on the ground. I'm going to walk us through general encounters with law enforcement, what to do if you encounter them at a protest, on your drive home, at your home later. And then I'll go into a little bit more specifics about if that encounter is with ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or any agency within the Department of Homeland Security. I'll also define those terms a little bit for you, so I'm not just speaking in acronyms of legalese. So whether or not you are a citizen, you have rights under the United States Constitution, as Johnny mentioned. The Fifth Amendment gives you the right to remain silent, not to answer questions that are asked by officers or a government agent. The Fourth Amendment restricts the government's ability to enter your home, search you or your vehicle or workplace. And the First Amendment, as Johnny mentioned, protects your freedom of speech and your right to assemble and voice your opinions. Now, if you're at a protest and you are approached by a law enforcement officer, the first thing you should do is ask if you're free to go. If the answer is yes, just walk away calmly, peacefully. If the police say you're not free to go, then you're being detained. This is not arrested, but they may want to ask you some questions. In this instance, they can pat you down outside of your clothing if they suspect you might be armed and have a weapon. If they begin searching more than that, it's important to assert your rights, like the right under the Fourth Amendment to unreasonable searches and seizures. So if they begin searching more than just patting you down, so your bag, your pockets, it's important to say that you do not consent to that search. They might keep searching anyway. If that happens, don't resist, because you may be charged with assault or resisting arrest. And I'll discuss when your rights will really come into play. In this moment, it is important to follow officers' commands. Now, if you're being detained or arrested means being taken into custody, you have the constitutional right to remain silent under the Fifth Amendment. You should affirmatively and unambiguously state that you wish to remain silent. Don't just be silent, state, I am exercising my right to remain silent. Under this amendment, you also have the right to an attorney. You should also affirmatively state that I want to speak to an attorney. In a criminal setting, you have the right to speak to an attorney, and if you cannot afford an attorney of your own, the government will provide one for you. Once you make this request to speak with an attorney, stop speaking. The Supreme Court has ruled that answering further questions after that can mean you're giving up your right to remain silent. So as I mentioned earlier, police can do whatever they want in that moment, at the protest, in the heat of the moment. If you realize they're violating your rights, arguing with them or resisting will likely not make a difference in that moment, and in fact could get you in more trouble or possibly end up with you being injured. Your rights are exercised and are protected in a court of law afterward. So in that moment, comply with officers' commands and exercise your right by stating, I'm exercising my right to remain silent. I do not consent to this search. Now, it's very important that you do not give out false information to a police officer or a false identity. Under Utah law, an officer may ask the following of you: your name, address, date of birth, and an explanation of your actions. Be careful here. You only need to disclose your name and date of birth. Failure to disclose those may be a criminal offense. But expounding on what you're doing, trying to explain it to an officer, more often than not, will lead to you admitting to a crime than convincing the officer not to charge you. So that's why that right to remain silent piece is so important. That right is there to protect you. Often our clients have admitted to a crime, and it's kind of hard to undo things that they've said in that moment. So again, the only things you are required to disclose under possible penalty of law is your name and date of birth. I'll get into some immigration specific disclosures in just a moment. But that's interactions at a protest. Let's say you're driving home and you're pulled over. As a member of the National Lawyers Guild and a legal observer with that organization, we have seen this happen to protesters. If this happens, an officer can ask for your license, vehicle registration, proof of insurance. You're required to have these things and have them current. Again, you can refuse to allow an officer to search your vehicle. Law enforcement can't search your vehicle unless they have probable cause to do so, or with your consent. So again, it's important to state that you do not consent to a search of your vehicle. That may happen regardless. Also, another tip going along with Johnny's recommendations not to do anything unlawful at a protest, don't bring anything unlawful with you. Don't bring weapons, don't bring any illegal substances, and don't keep those things in your vehicle. Now, what to do if a law enforcement officer comes to your home afterward? The National Lawyers Guild has also seen this. So if officers believe you've committed some crime at the protest but didn't arrest you then, they may come to your house with a warrant. Police need a search warrant to enter your home, and they need an arrest warrant to arrest you unless you're currently in the act of violating the law, violating the law in that moment. Officers are not always straightforward when they come to your door. They might just say they want to ask a few questions, even though they intend to arrest you. Ask an officer to see a warrant if they ask to come inside, and make sure that that warrant is signed by a judge. If it is, then you need to comply with that warrant. Now I'm going to get into specifics with the Department of Homeland Security, or as a lot of you may have heard, ICE. So the Department of Homeland Security is under the executive branch. That means it's controlled by the president. He's their boss. And under the Department of Homeland Security, you have agencies including Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, Citizenship and Immigration Services, and Customs and Border Patrol. I'm primarily focusing on ICE here. First, and this is extremely important, kind of along with the false identity piece, do not claim to be a US citizen if you are not. This can lead to some serious consequences. A lot of people want to know if you need to answer questions about your immigration status. The answer is no. If you're undocumented, out of status, or a permanent resident, you do not have to answer questions about your immigration history. Now, if you're over the age of 18, you do need to carry your immigration papers with you. If an immigration officer asks for these, you must show it to them. And if you do not have them, I advise you to exercise your right to remain silent. If ICE comes to your home, don't open the door unless ICE shows you a warrant signed by a judge. You can ask for them to hold it up to a window or slide it under the door, but we recommend that you don't go outside or invite them into your home without that warrant. So worst case scenario, let's say you've been detained by Immigration and Customs Enforcement, either at your home or at a protest. We have seen federal agents at protests, particularly the VP debate last week, and in other states we've seen this. Once again, you should exercise your right to remain silent. Ask to call an attorney if you have one, or call a family or friend who might be able to help you acquire an attorney. Don't sign anything if you don't understand what it is, or what I recommend until you've had a chance to discuss what it is with an attorney. A lot of these documents are not clear and easy to understand, and don't rely on an officer's explanation of it. Now, the next step beyond that is if the government is trying to deport you from the country because they're accusing you of violating your immigration status in a few ways I mentioned and a few ways Johnny mentioned. You most likely will have the right to go in front of an immigration judge. That is, go into immigration court or deportation proceedings. If you are in immigration court, you are entitled to an attorney, but not at the government's expense, like in the criminal setting. So you will need to find and pay for your own attorney if you're not able to find one who will offer services pro bono. Now, very quickly, I was asked to touch on who the National Lawyers Guild is and what we do. The National Lawyers Guild, was founded in 1937, and we're the nation's oldest and largest progressive bar association. That means we're an organization of lawyers, law students, other legal workers who our primary goal is to work for the people and protect your constitutional rights. Kind of our mission statement whittled down is we value human rights over property rights. And we're dedicated to undoing political and systemic structures of oppression that affect immigrants, people of color, women, LGBT groups, rights of workers, farmers, any who might be oppressed by current systems. And so we do that in a few different ways. One of the most visible ways is by legal observing protests. That means we get trained and we go out. You'll see us in bright neon green hats. I wish I had mine here today. And we're there to observe the actions of police in anticipation of litigation. That means either to defend protesters in criminal defense settings or bring charges against the state for civil rights violations. We also have a jail support hotline. Legal observers will be giving out that number at protests. So if you are arrested, if a friend is arrested or you observe an arrest, you can call this hotline and report that either during the protest or after. We also provide court support and attorney referrals. Our Utah chapter is not big enough at the moment to have our own attorneys, but we work very closely with reputable attorneys in the community to provide that defense and representation to protect those rights.
Can I just tack on a couple more things that Mel and I discussed earlier? And she alluded to this a little bit, but she mentioned how sometimes police or sometimes ICE is not always straightforward. Sometimes they're deceptive. And Mel rightly said, if they come to your home, you can ask for that warrant, but don't go outside. I had a client who someone approached her home, knocked on the door, and told her they were with a construction company and she needed to go outside and move her car. They didn't have a warrant. They were ICE agents. And once she left her home, they then arrested her because she was out on the street. They couldn't have gone into her home, and had she stayed there, she would have been okay. They don't always follow the rules. The police, don't, as we know, don't always follow the laws either. And so protect yourself that way. Just be aware that they can do things like that. The other thing is, if you do have a problem, any kind of criminal charge that threatens your immigration status, feel free to contact an attorney at the pro bono legal clinics that the SJ Quinney Law School provides 3 times a month for immigration. And we do about 12 different pro bono clinics. I'm posting a link to our pro bono site that has all of these legal clinics. Chelsea, I'm not sure if all the people on here can see that link. If not, would you make sure that they get that? Look through that list of free legal sites that we do each month. If you ever have a problem with any kind of matter in the law, most of the things that you might encounter, we can handle at one of the clinics. So take advantage of that. We don't charge. At the conclusion of the meeting where you meet with a law student and also with an attorney, it's usually about a 15-minute, 20-minute appointment, give or take. And at the conclusion of that, we can recommend reputable, trusted attorneys who might be able to help you. Mel is one of the attorneys that helps us with that clinic. We have great attorneys who know what they're doing and care about immigrants and really want to help you navigate what can be a very difficult and complicated legal scenario. Okay, thanks.
Thanks so much, Johnny and Mel, for sharing all of that valuable information. I'm not sure if the audience can see the link for the pro bono clinics that Johnny mentioned, but we will make sure that this information is shared after this webinar. We'll be posting it on our website, and it's something that we can also include in a follow-up email after today's session. Before we move on to the question and answer portion, though, I would like to introduce Brian Burton to discuss our last topic on the Student Code of Conduct on campus and student rights on campus. Brian, go ahead and get started.
Thanks, Chelsea. I'm honored to be here. Just briefly, I've been asked to give an overview of the University of Utah's Student Code of Rights and Responsibilities. Johnny and Mel have given a great overview of your constitutional rights, and our student code is, if you think of an umbrella, our student code is under that. And so there's nothing in our student code that would abridge or take away from those constitutional rights that you are afforded. But before I jump into that piece, I think it's helpful also to just quickly give an overview of the Office of the Dean of Students. It's an area of campus that often people hear about, but know very little about what we actually do. So in short, there are two functional areas that we do within the Office of the Dean of Students. The first being is student support, and this is available to all current students. And what this is intended to do is to be a resource to connect both on and off campus resources for students who are navigating things that are impacting their ability to be successful as a student. So it very well could be, as we've talked about today, navigating litigation, where we are not attorneys. It would be connecting to the resource perhaps that Johnny shared with the Pro Bono Clinic, connecting students to the counseling center, etc. So our student support arm is a piece of what we do. The other part that we do is really wrapped up in our University Policy 6-400. And Chelsea, I'll send you that link as well to get out to the group. But that is our university policy, wherein it articulates your student bill of rights, but also articulates expectations of behavior. And I'll talk just briefly about those. So first, in terms of expectations of behaviors, as part of the university community, you are expected to behave in certain ways. And really the fundamental obligation that we have as community members is to not violate the rights of other individuals within our university. And so our student code prohibits certain behavior, such as presenting false or misleading information to university officials. It prevents and prohibits physical assault or verbal assault, sexual assault as well. Within our student code, it also outlines academic misconduct pieces, so prohibiting plagiarism and cheating, etc. And so that's the piece that often I think gets mentioned and is thought about in the Office of the Dean of Students, is where I am sent when I have violated some of these standards of behavior. However, the other piece that I think really is applicable to this conversation is specifically the Student Bill of Rights. And within that, students, again, have rights as members of our university community. And I want to talk through a few of those rights as we lead into the Q&A. I think that gives a nice foundation for the discussion, but then also supplements what Mel and Johnny have already talked about. So students first have the right of a learning environment. Students have the right to support and assistance from the university in maintaining a climate that is conducive to thinking and learning. This really primarily happens within the classroom. So the university and you have a right for your learning environment there. You do have specific rights in the classroom. You have, for example, the right to reasonable notice of the general content of the course. So what you're going to be graded on. You have a right that you will be graded without prejudice and without favoritism, that you'll be graded consistently amongst your peers. That's a right that you as a student have. You have a right to a role of governance within the University of Utah. So while you can't participate in national elections, as a student, you are able to participate in student body elections. So you are able to elect student representatives. You are able to run as student representatives as well for positions within our student government. You have the right to due process. And this really, we see an intersection here with our behavioral expectations. But essentially what that is if you as a student are ever alleged to have violated any part of university policy or our student code, you have the right to be notified, and then you have the right to respond to that. Essentially, this right to be heard and a right for that decision to be reviewed by a neutral and an impartial body. And that is a right that you have as a student. We've talked about this already. You have, the right to be here and to be free from discrimination and harassment. And then freedom of expression is another right that is spelled specifically in the Bill of Rights for students. Students have the right to examine and communicate ideas by any lawful means. So this is again the piece that Johnny talked about, that you have those rights to operate within legal parameters. Students cannot and will not be subject to academic or behavioral sanctions because of constitutionally protected exercises of freedom of association, assembly, expression, or press. So those are those pieces. And I think Chelsea brought up an important piece to keep in mind is though they may not be violations of law or of our student code, there are perhaps perceptions or things beyond the borders of the university that you might consider when you engage in some of these activities. So those are just a few of the rights that you have as students. And specifically, I think there has been a lot of conversation. We talked a little bit about the vice president debate that took place. A lot of students exercise that right to assemble, the right to join and congregate within student organizations to make their voice heard and to exercise that First Amendment right to protest and to become, engaged and active on that. Again, within the bounds of university policy. Often we get questions in our office about how far or what is the reach of the student code. And what I mean by that is primarily the student code of rights and responsibilities applies to your actions while you are on campus. For example, the student code, we wouldn't look at student code charges if you were, arrested in Salt Lake City necessarily. It really is constrained and pretty narrowly defined as actions that occur on the University of Utah campus. So the last piece that I want to maybe cover just briefly again is if you are ever alleged of any part of our student code, again, we talked about the right that you have to due process. Typically what you would expect from our office is we would reach out to you via email or text to be able to contact you and share with you to say, this is the information that we have. If this is true, it may be a violation of our student code. And that's an important distinction, that we are looking at whether or not you violated university policy. We don't investigate or adjudicate any criminal behavior. It simply is saying, have you violated a part of our university policy? And then we would invite you to come and meet with us to share your side and come to a resolution of that. In that process, you always have a right to have an advisor with you who may but need not be an attorney. It could be a staff member, it could be a friend, etc. But then the purpose of that is to come to a resolution of that policy violation if we indeed find that there is one. And then if we're not able to reach a resolution at that level, then we do have an option and an opportunity for you to move to what's called the Student Behavior Committee, where a group of your peers, staff and faculty would look at the case and they would make an evaluation at that point. So that's just a brief overview of our student code of rights and responsibilities. Again, within that, the university also references policies of gathering together to have your voices heard on campus, speech rights, posting rights. That's a policy outside of our student code, but it's something that we can certainly talk about, and I imagine will come up in our Q&A. So I hope that's a helpful overview, Chelsea, and I'll kick it back to you.
Thanks, Brian. That was a great overview for the Student Code of Conduct. For this final portion of our session today, we'll be moving into the question and answer portion. We haven't had anybody submit any questions yet through the Q&A feature at the bottom. So we did have some questions that were submitted during the registration process. So we'll go ahead and begin with those. But if you do have any questions, or if any questions have come up while the panelists were speaking today, please go ahead and submit those questions using that Q&A button at the bottom. And just as a reminder, again, you can submit those questions so that they're completely anonymous and confidential and will not show up either to the panelists or within our recording after today's session. Right, so I will go ahead and ask the first question here. Political conversations can escalate very quickly. What are some of the best ways to dialogue without getting emotional or angry, particularly when interacting with others with differing political opinions? Don't know which one of our panelists would like to start with that particular question. I think that's a question we all probably need a reminder about, particularly during today's times. Johnny, I'll go ahead and pass it over to you.
So I have a few thoughts on this. I am pretty active on Twitter, and I have some strong opinions politically. But one thing I feel like I have been able to do is show empathy and understand people and respect their points of view. And much of the discord, much of the really unproductive social discourse that I see is a result of people being so convinced that they are right and not being willing to consider that someone else's position on any issue is valid, that they are entitled to have that view. And too quickly, we devolve into attacking someone else. And so you can't always expect that somebody else that you're engaging with will respond in an appropriate civil demeanor and manner, but you can always be the one to act that way. You can be just as heard, and in fact, probably more often, you'll be more heard if you engage civilly with people and respect their point of view. And unfortunately, I think that's the one thing that our society is missing, is that civility when we disagree.
I'll add to that, and really just in agreement with what Johnny said. I think all too often when we don't agree with someone, it's easy to then generalize that if I don't agree with Brian, for example, or Brian's particular view on this topic, that Brian and everything about him is awful. And that's just simply not the case. So I think your ability to remain calm, and I think listening is important as well, because so often, someone who may view things differently than me is not going to convince me differently. But if I'm willing to listen, I may understand their perspective. And similarly, I'm not going to convince someone else necessarily of what is right or wrong, quote unquote. But I think the ability to listen and engage with civility and respect is so needed today. So I would agree with what Johnny shared. That's great advice.
All right, I will go ahead and move on to our next question. Can you explain the role that the Black Lives Matter movement may have had in this election? I know this is sort of outside of the topics of the scope of conversation here, but it is related to the social justice issues that many of our students are involved in today. So would any of our panelists like to provide some opinions on that question?
Yes, I think, Black Lives Matter has been around much longer than this year. And every time there's a high profile incident where a Black individual is killed by police, they have time and time again brought those issues to the forefront. And I think we've reached a tipping point this year, and maybe it's a combination of factors, but I think it's finally brought this discussion, which has been around even longer than Black Lives Matter movement, to the forefront, and have gotten high level politicians to discuss the disparities that the Black community particularly face in this country, and more broadly people of color, but the African American population faces very specific forms of oppression and repression in this country. And I really appreciate the fact that they are bringing this to the forefront. And as someone who's on the ground observing these protests as a legal observer, a lot of the times we are out there observing Black Lives Matter protests. And the news focuses on the negative. That's kind of what the news does. but a vast majority of the protests across the country have been peaceful and have been happening literally every day since George Floyd's death in May. And I commend the work that they're doing.
Can I add to that? This reminds me of what we talked about earlier with the way you demonstrate, the way that you engage in civil discourse can have a really important impact in a positive way, or you can be detrimental to a cause. I've heard people who are opposed to the Black Lives Matter movement, and almost always they point to the fact that there is violence in the protests. And I think that not always the people who are being violent are the ones that are truly behind the cause. Sometimes people just want to be discordant and want to disrupt society and be chaotic and anarchists. But unfortunately, that has a real impact on a very, very important social movement, as people who may be persuaded to understand what the message is, and they're very turned off by the violent protests. And so as you engage, not just for the sake of your immigration status, but to get the message across of whatever political or social cause you might be interested in pushing, consider how your actions can impact that cause. Are you going to be a positive influence on the cause itself and get the message out in a positive manner? Or are you going to turn people away from the cause because of your actions? And I think if each of you will take responsibility to behave in an appropriate way, that doesn't mean you have to be peaceful in the sense of, quiet and mute and not willing to share what's important to you. Certainly be vocal, but do so in an appropriate manner so you bring strength to the cause rather than tear it down.
All right, our next question is about political demonstrations on campus, and this ties in well to the discussion about the Black Lives Matter movement as well. Can students hold political demonstrations on campus? If so, who would they need to contact? What permissions would they need to receive in order to gather? And then is there any additional information about how these activities may tie into any impacts to the student code of conduct that students should be aware of? Brian, I'll start with you.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that Johnny earlier really set up this idea of the University of Utah can place limits on this that are called time, place, and manner restrictions, that the university can say, you can't, for example, disrupt a classroom and the learning environment there with a protest. But really, I think one of the questions that we often get around this is, can these protests happen? If so, how do we navigate that? And the answer to that is yes, they can, absolutely. The union scheduling office is a great resource to help students kind of think through the logistics of those pieces. Our office as well is one where we've assisted a number of students and student organizations to navigate the permission to gather. Very common places that students will gather, and this is again outside of our COVID restrictions, but the Marriott Library, the Union Plaza seem to be popular areas, high traffic areas where students can go. But really all open spaces outside of buildings are available for assembly and speech. In that way, and to the other part of that question is, we would ask for those same things, that gathering and making your voices and opinions heard in and of itself is not a violation at all of our student code. But if there were destruction of buildings, spray painting, other things like that would violate not just our student code, but also potentially criminal law, that's the piece where we would look at charging student code violations if there were physical assaults, if there were threats of violence made, for example. But again, the right to gather and to have your voices heard for a cause, absolutely, that's not only allowed but encouraged. I think that's a great sign of activism and a great way to be engaged as a student.
Thanks, Brian. Our next question is tied in a little bit to that question as well. This question is, I've heard that there are free speech zones on campus. This was in quotes. Is this true? What are the rules for these spaces? And does it also apply to digital content and discussions online, particularly since classes are now primarily held online as well?
Yeah, so I can start on this one as well, and if others have things to add. So again, historically, that area right outside of the Union building, just west of the Union, typically or historically was called the free speech zone, and that has reference back to even the Vietnam War and that how that space was utilized by student protesters. But the reality of that is since it has grown to include all outdoor areas on campus. We are all, after all, a public institution that students can engage in that way. So in terms of specific places, yes, again, kind of outside areas, public areas outside of buildings, absolutely that would be a place that can be used. And in the electronic space, this is something I think that I hope I'm answering the question here that perhaps is related to the exchange of ideas within a classroom now that we've shifted things online. But yes, so kind of the idea of academic freedom, that's something that, again, students are encouraged and faculty are encouraged to express freely their ideas and opinions. But again, you can't be disruptive in the classroom. And that's something that is determined by our faculty on where that is. And I don't know if that's exactly what the question is getting at, and I'm happy to go another way with it if that's maybe not answering the question as it was posed.
I think you probably answered the question, Brian. Although if anybody does have any follow-up questions with that particular question, please go ahead and submit those again through the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. For now, I will go ahead and move on to the next question since we're running out of time here. This question is specifically, it states, I've had a negative encounter with law enforcement in the past. Who would you suggest I contact?
So it's kind of an ambiguous question. I'm not sure what the nature of the interaction was. One thing I can recommend, and I don't know if the individual who asked this question is here today, I hope so. The National Lawyers Guild Utah chapter has a jail-legal support hotline that you're welcome to call. And it's live during protests. It's not live other times, but an attorney will follow up with your question. That phone number is 801-410-0393. And again, Chelsea, I can send that over to you if there's a more accessible way to somewhere to post that. I'm especially with criminal defense questions or civil rights questions. And then, as Johnny mentioned, the pro bono initiative clinics are another place where you can get some free initial advice and suggestions on kind of where to go from here, depending on the nature of that negative interaction, kind of not being sure exactly what it was.
And just one piece of advice, if you are charged with a crime, we get too many clients that come into our clinics who have already pled guilty to whatever they were charged with. And it's a rare case when an attorney can't get you a better deal on a plea deal, or at least advise you, especially if you have immigration issues or immigration status that could be at risk. Do not plead guilty to any charges that you may be charged with. Come in, talk to us, and get knowledge about your circumstances first so you can make an informed decision about what's best for you. Another resource you might consider is the ACLU of Utah, the American Civil Liberties Union. They take up causes where civil rights are violated. So if it's related to national origin discrimination or race discrimination or issues like that, they might be a good resource as well.
And one thing I'll add, Chelsea, I know that we're coming up on time, that if the concern is about an interaction that you had with campus police, the university recently hired a new Chief of Police Rodney Chapman. I've met with him a number of times. He is very much wanting to engage with students and understand and hear feedback from students. And so to the extent you'd feel comfortable with either us passing on a message on your behalf or helping to facilitate a meeting with Chief Chapman to share some of that feedback, we would be happy to do that.
Just right here as we're coming up on time, there was another question related to many of the resources that you've all shared so far, but it is asking about what platforms, websites, resources do you recommend for learning more information or getting involved? You know, there have already been several resources that have been shared, but if you have any additional thoughts on resources for students, I will go ahead and pass it over to you.
Yeah, I would definitely, I was only very briefly able to cover what the National Lawyers Guild does, but you don't need to be a lawyer or a law student to get involved with us. Our website, nlg.org/Utah, is a great place to see how, if you're interested in legal observing, anyone can do that. If you want to request legal observers for your action, you can do so at that website. And then nlg.org is the national website, and you can learn more about the organization, our politics. We're very related to what the ACLU does, and we partner with them locally, but we do have a different ideological bent than they do. So I encourage you to learn about us, and if you are interested in getting involved, you know, in street actions and protests, we're a great vehicle to do that.
I'll put a plug in for Chelsea's office. They are a great resource for students, in our international students as well. We partner with them often, but that's a great one-stop shop for students to then connect out to resources on and off campus.
Thanks, Brian. We appreciate that plug. But yes, all of you are certainly welcome to connect with ISSS. And if we don't know the answers, we will certainly put you in contact with those who do. You could always email us at international@utah.edu. Come call our office. Right now, we're mostly operating in a virtual space, so our advising appointments are over the phone or through teleconferencing. But if you are in a serious situation or if you're in a crisis situation, there are still individuals within the office who can meet with you should that situation occur. So we are certainly here for you, and we will continue to support you in any way that we can. I would like to sincerely thank all of our expert panelists here, Mel, Brian, Johnny. Thank you so much for joining us and for sharing all of your perspective and all of this valuable information with our students today. We will be adding information and the resources that were shared today to our website, and we'll also share some of this information in a follow-up email after this webinar. I do have one quick final slide here to share with all of you as we're ending for the day, and we will leave this up as you're all leaving. You can scan this QR code and it will take you directly to our webinar series website on the ISSS website. If you have any other questions that weren't answered today, please go ahead and reach out to us. We will search for those answers if we don't know them and respond back to you as quickly as we can. We hope that you enjoyed today's session, and our next webinar session will be held next Tuesday, October 20th, again at 4 p.m. And the topic of that day will be on US media and consumerism. So we look forward to having you join us. And feel free to scan that QR code, and we'll leave it up for just a few more minutes as we're exiting here today. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope that you enjoy the content, and thank you again to our panelists. Have a great evening, everybody. Thank you again. Good night.